China and Portugal have been in contact since the age of discovery, when Portuguese explorers and priests traveled to China along the ancient maritime Silk Road. Hundreds of years later, as China embarks upon its Belt and Road Initiative, Portugal once again has expressed its interest in coming on board. Economic ties between the two sides are becoming increasingly close. Chinese companies have invested in Portuguese enterprises in recent years, including Energia de Portugal, an energy company, and Redes Energéticas Nacionais, REN, the Portuguese National Energy Network Company. Some analysts have said Chinese investment has helped the government to reduce sovereign debt during the economic crisis, but others are concerned that the EU member is on the road to economic and political dependence on China. So are these concerns legitimate? How do Portuguese entrepreneurs currently perceive China-Portugal ties? To find out, Castro Henriques, Chairman and CEO of AICEP, Portuguese Trade and Investment Agency, are joining me in the studio for discussion. So, Mr. Henriques, thank you very much for joining us here in the studio. First of all, I understand you are here for talks in the automobile sector. Could you elaborate on the current state of cooperation between the two sides in the automobile sector? Where are we, and how important is the Chinese market for Portuguese automakers?
Well, first of all, hello, Chin. Thank you for inviting me to your show.
Welcome.
Well, we are starting to work. There's still a lot of work to do. We've been having contacts with the Chinese automakers for quite a while now, a couple of years, and we've been working to try to identify opportunities for both parts. We believe Portugal is extremely competitive at this moment. We have received significant investment in the automotive sector from France and Germany, so I think this shows the competitiveness of our country for that sector. And we also see Chinese companies improving immensely on their products and leapfrogging, in particular in the electric vehicle sector. So Portugal would like to be at the forefront of the partnership for that.
So what is your main message to Chinese automakers or investors in the auto industry? What do you want to say to them as the advantages of Portugal?
Well, very, very simply, I think with the amount of investment we've received from China, especially in the financial and energetic sector in these past few years, we can really show to other Chinese companies how successful this has been. So the first message is, look, other Chinese investors have invested in Portugal and it has been a success. The second point is, we've been receiving quite the biggest productive sector investing in Portugal has been the auto sector. This is the biggest sector the agency deals with, and this just shows the competitiveness of Portugal for that sector, whether it is in component production, in car manufacturing, in the IT sector for the car manufacturing industry, in R&D. Just to give you an idea, nowadays you have a significant amount of multimedia solutions within your car that have been conceptualized, developed and produced in Portugal for the European market. And so at this moment we think we have a very competitive offer for Chinese automakers.
Well, Portugal, people would say, is a relatively small economy, right? The domestic demand is really very, very minimal compared to the gigantic scale of Chinese automakers. What kind of leverage does Portugal have to lure Chinese investors?
You're absolutely right. We have a very, very small country. Our population is actually less than the city of Beijing. Now, you can't look at Portugal from that perspective. Portugal is a full member of the EU, so our real internal market is the EU, so we're talking about 500 million consumers. But on top of that, Portugal has direct ties to the Portuguese-speaking countries around the world. So this means that we have another 280 million consumers that can be accessed directly from Portugal. So when you look at Portugal, you need to think of Portugal as a country where your destination is of 780 million people rather than just 10 million people.
At this moment, that is very rosy picture, by the way, but at this moment we are looking at some very strong headwinds, I think needless to say, coming from the United States. Very strong signals that trade should not be free, that people should not just put wherever they want to put their money in. Actually, very strong tariffs have been placed on a couple of sectors, and the auto industry is on the line, possibly the next to be taxed by President Trump. What does that mean for the auto business in Portugal, and is that going to be an opportunity, an obstacle?
Well, I think it still is a bit too early to speak on the consequences of any tariffs that still aren't out. However, if you break down the figures I gave you, I'm not really sure this will directly affect trade within the European Union or trade between Portugal, which is a European Union country, and Africa and South America. However, there is a very, very important factor for Portugal here. Portugal is a country that thrives on globalization. We're a small open economy, so we benefit from having as global a market as possible. And a new trend which goes against open markets, which goes against global trade, is actually not positive for Portugal. However, I think it really is too early to discuss consequences. I think at the end of the day, this might affect the productive capacity in certain regions. But above all, and I think this is the main message that the Chinese automakers need to understand at this moment, is, look, Portugal is an extremely competitive location for you in Europe. We're actually one of the best locations in the world according to the World Bank. And I think we need to work on this notoriety. Most of the meetings I've had with the automakers, well, they actually never thought of Portugal for that. And when I tell them, do you know actually what is the biggest sector investing in Portugal is the auto sector, they are quite surprised.
Speaking of Chinese investment, naturally we are touching on some very sensitive nerves here. China's investment to Portugal, by the way, exceeded 9 billion euros for 2017. That's about $10.5 billion US. As I mentioned in the beginning of the show, mostly so far Chinese investors have been in the energy sector, and the stake has been relatively high, either 23% or 25%. And some people, as I again said, are worried of the kind of influence China might have on the independence of Portuguese economy or politics. Are you not afraid of that?
Not at all. And I'm actually glad that you asked this, because I see a lot of discussion sometimes on this. From a Portuguese perspective, we really don't see that in that way. Actually, we see the Chinese investors as very, very fruitful for Portugal. They invested in a period of serious crisis in Portugal, so they took a risk. They have been successful with that. We have strong industrial partnerships in all of those companies with the respective Chinese investors. So this is also an opportunity for expansion for the Portuguese companies. So we are very, very glad with Chinese investment.
On the other hand, we're talking about Portuguese investment in China compared to China's $10.5 billion US. That number is really small. 2017, that's 210 million US dollars. What is Portuguese position on investment in China?
Well, I think the outlook is positive, but the first thing that you have to compare is the different sizes between countries, first of all. The second thing, and this is obviously relevant, we underwent a very, very serious crisis in 2011 to 2013. So obviously Portuguese companies are expanding more on an export basis rather than investing abroad, because some of them, and to be very, very truthful, are still licking their wounds from the crisis. Nevertheless, I think there will be growing investment from Portuguese companies in China. What we've seen at the agency is that the numbers of companies interested in China and doing first missions to understand the Chinese market has been increasing significantly. And we can't forget this. We, just like China, and just like I mentioned, we also have a very, very big internal market. So the first focus within the crisis was obviously to focus on the internal European market. I think China will be developing these exports gradually. On average, on a long-term trend, we've seen that these exports have grown on an yearly basis at around 8%, if you include also services. And I believe this trend will continue.
You're talking about trend in investment or trade in goods? Okay.
But it is very, very important to understand that the type of investment that we're trying to bring now, I am sure that this diversification will also focus on doing further business with China. So consequently, just like we did with the other investment from other European countries, this will increase significantly our trade with China too.
Let's talk a little bit about trade. Figures from China's customs show that bilateral trade between Portugal and China in 2017 exceeded $5.6 billion US. Among that, very interestingly, Chinese exports dropped year on year by about 14%, whereas Chinese imports from Portugal increased by almost 35%. What do the ups and downs tell us?
Well, I think we need to look, and the agency does this. I mean, we did it with trend on a daily basis. So we actually look more at trends rather than specific years. On a specific year basis, we try to understand whether that event will be significant for the future.
What's the trend here then?
The trend has been a growth one, both, and now let me put this on from a Chinese perspective, both for Chinese exports, but also for Portuguese imports. Chinese exports have grown in the past 5 years at a yearly rate of about 10%, and Portuguese imports have grown at about 8%.
You mean Portuguese exports to China? Or
yes, Portuguese exports towards China.
Also has been growing by 8%?
Everything has been growing. So I think that the movements that we've seen in 2017 are for just that year. These are normal movements on a specific year basis because, you know, you obviously have companies that have orders that don't go through, some exports that actually don't go through even if they're ordered. And I think there's also a specific impact in 2017, which actually goes to the Portuguese exports regarding, well, towards China, which is our biggest export actually is cars nowadays. We export Volkswagens towards China. And in 2017 was actually a year where they changed their line of manufacturing. So it's normal that they reduce their exports, and as you can see in 2018 they're increasing immensely. But nothing significant. I only see good news, and I think the future this trend will keep up.
Do you foresee China's Belt and Road Initiative, as we continue to promote this initiative, bringing any further scope for bilateral trade and investment? I
do, at two levels. Prior to that, I think it's very, very important to understand, and I hope that our Portuguese viewers see this. The Belt and Road Initiative is of paramount importance for China. Now, if it is of paramount importance for China, it will definitely have a very, very big impact globally. Definitely, so from a Portuguese perspective, we need to see how we can embrace that. The first level will be, I think, there can be further cooperation even on the transports and routes that we have towards China, which will definitely increase trade. The second trend is, I think it will also broaden the perspective on investment from Chinese companies towards Portugal, but especially on a triangular basis between Portuguese companies, Chinese companies, for instance, in African countries. And that will increase trade for both countries, probably in third-party countries.
Very interesting. Also, I think it is very important that people understand each other better on a people-to-people exchange level. Good news is that in 2017, 1.6 million Chinese visited Portugal. That's an increase of 41% year-on-year. What's behind that, and how significant is that for the Portuguese economy?
Well, I hope and I believe that the Chinese have discovered how nice the Portuguese can be, and how we are a country that has dealt for centuries with other countries. Let me give you a figure which I think is very, very relevant. Most of our youngsters speak at least 2 foreign languages. No one learns a foreign language unless he wants to deal with someone from a different country that speaks a different language. So we're a country which is culturally very, very open. We've dealt with China for hundreds of years with our relationship with Macau. And so I think the Chinese have finally discovered that Portuguese people are very, very happy to have them visiting Portugal. We've also had a very, very big improvement, which was a direct flight from Beijing to Lisbon. So that helps a lot because it makes it easier. But above all, I think there's a discovery process going on.
Okay, great. I hope I'll be able to visit Portugal for the first time myself as well. Thank you very much.
I hope so too.
Thank you very much, Castro Henriques, Chairman and CEO of AICEP from Portugal.